English translation, 714th contact. Part 1, Tuesday the 1st of January 2019, 21:51 hours.
There you are waiting, dear friend, but be welcome, Ptah.
Thanks for your welcome, and greetings also to you, Edouard, dear friend. Today we have special things to discuss again, some of which is to be recalled and written down by you.
Of course, that is okay.
First, I want to talk about what is on our minds because we have tried to clarify what would happen regarding his plans if he wanted to realize them in the USA. In our very laborious and profound investigation in this regard, which was carried out by Yanarara and Quetzal, because both are already commissioned in connection with the strange occurrences of the materializations as well as the disturbances and damages in relation to your work with the computer, an unpleasant result has undoubtedly emerged. A realization of his plans in the USA cannot bring success, because all conditions are unfulfillable for, on the one hand, both financially and in terms of personal cooperation, but also in terms of factual aspects. On the other hand, his idea of being able to carry out, create, and produce a realistic realization of the project he has in mind in the USA is an absolute illusion and impossibility. If he were to attempt it anyway, he would face unsolvable problems and, moreover, difficulties which he would not be able to overcome and which would therefore lead to serious complications, possibly also with respect to his freedom and health. The project he has conceived in his mind I can endorse and find good, though his aim to realize it in the USA is without any doubt completely impossible. If he ultimately wants to realize his plans and thus his conceived project, then only Switzerland offers him the possibility of doing so, which would, however, also entail, on the one hand, working out his own financial means, and, on the other hand, making an effort to obtain voluntary subsidies from persons interested in the creation of the project. Yanarara and Zaphanat-Paneach have also made an effort to clarify this and have found that the project can be realized in this way. So these are the facts that you are supposed to explain, after which his mind and reason are asked to his correct decision.
I will do that, but I will wait and not talk to him until I have retrieved and written down our conversation, and therefore your explanation, which will take some time because I have all sorts of other things to do, so I probably will not be able to retrieve and write down our conversation today until the end of February. I cannot and do not want to leave the work I am doing for you, because if I did, I would get into a tailspin. Besides what I do for you and all the other things that come up on a purely private basis, I also have to manage somehow.
That is as I know, and it will probably also not be so urgent to pass on my explanation. But what would interest me in his project would be a pertinent concept that he should make out. Because alone all the explanations that he has released to you and that you have mentioned to me are not such that I can comprehensively imagine everything myself.
Okay, so I can do that without first retrieving our conversation and presenting to him what you have explained and what clarification results Yanarara and Zaphanat-Paneach have obtained.
In fact, it should not be problematic and therefore possible to arrange to do what is necessary with regard to the preparation of a relevant concept.
Exactly, that's what I am saying.
But it will probably take time, then.
Of course, because he certainly cannot do magic. I would also like to come back to what has happened because we have to decide what to do next Saturday at the General Assembly.
We have, of course, clarified that and established that the illness is serious. Consequently, the membership is to be continued in the same way as silent membership, as with, and whereby the future will prove how the health condition develops.
That's what I also thought, just that action should be taken within the same framework as in the 3 other cases. After all, there is always the possibility that such ailments will return to normal in time and thus resolve themselves. Consequently, depending on how everything turns out, action can then be taken fairly and logically, which is why any path that arises in the future must be left open.
In this respect, I have noticed through my observations of Earth humans that unfortunately very many do not endeavor to understand these symptoms of illness. Consequently, they fall prey to aberrant condemnations.
I know that, but I think that with us in the Figu such deviousness, as you call it, will not be given, because our core group and passive members are constantly learning to concern themselves with more things than just their own self-development, and thereby also work towards also correctly judging diverse things that are foreign related. And the fact that there is a lively interest in all this is proven again and again when questions are asked and longer conversations arise and are conducted, or letter responses are written.
I am aware of that.
Exactly. But now I think you already have the latest data regarding the total earthly population. If you would like to give it to me right at the beginning of our conversation, because I am wondering about the growth craze last year. Your clarifications, after all, record the individual human beings still born at the last moment up to midnight on the 31st of December.
Our clarifications in this regard are extremely accurate, following which I can name the number of 109,723,416 Earth humans that were shown on our recorders last night, on the 31st of December 2018 at 0000 HRS, whereby exactly at 23 HRS, 59 minutes and 56 seconds in the vicinity of Campo Grande in the region of Mato Grosso do Sul, the last birth in 2018 took place among indigenous people. This brings the total Earth humans to 8,953,851,416, that is to say, 8,953,851,416 Earth humans.
Steep, contrary to the lies of the world population counters. Almost 9 billion Earthlings now populate the planet, while the wrongly counting world population clock only brings it to 7.7 billion. While if it continues in the same framework as before, in 2028 or in another 9 years, the Earth will already have 10 billion human beings to carry and feed. This, while the scientists who deal with the growth of human beings, according to the world population count clock, falsely claim that the Earth is now populated by just under 7.7 billion human beings. And the bullshit, according to Source Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations, that humanity in 2100 would only amount to about 11 billion and 200 million Earth humans is a deliberate lie and a malicious deception of the highest order towards Earth humans, preventing by all means the introduction of a worldwide multi-year birth stop and a likewise worldwide birth control in order to drastically reduce overpopulation. If we consider that the globe is already populated by almost 9 billion human beings who need to be supplied with food, but that this overpopulation will continue to grow inexorably and will require more and more food and countless other diverse necessities, then it is obvious to any sensible human being what a sad end it will all come to. The effective fact is that every single human being that is born and needs all kinds of products to exist and to live will increase all the already existing problems in every respect. But the irresponsible governments of all countries do not care, because through their cowardice and unreasonableness, and because they want to keep their well-paid offices and posts, they shrink from informing their populations that a birth stop and birth control is of absolutely urgent necessity if all evils and destructions of any kind are to be stopped. However, this bar is very far away, because effectively nothing is being done. But on the contrary, Earth humans continue to be misled with lies, false statistics, and fraud, especially the juveniles who are increasingly taking to the streets to demonstrate against climate change, which is effectively climate destruction. Neither the juveniles nor the entire world population are told or explained what the real origin and cause of the whole climate disaster is, namely the inexorably growing overpopulation and all the resulting machinations that are becoming more and more degenerate in terms of the destruction of the climate, nature, fauna, and flora. There is also silence about the fact that it is not only CO2, and thus the ever-increasing tonnages of toxic exhaust gases from automobiles, machines of all kinds, lorries, motorbikes, ships, airplanes, military vehicles, battle tanks, combat aircraft, and explosive materials, as well as the countless motorsport vehicles, etc., that are destroying the climate more and more. But also the countless chimneys, etc., through which more and more greenhouse gases are being produced. However, there are countless other causes that generate emissions and contribute to climate destruction. In particular, all the various toxins that poison the entire environment through agriculture, small and large-scale gardening, through the cultivation of industrial crops, but also through private gardening as fertilizers. In this respect, toxins such as herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, and insecticides, such as TEP, rodenticides, neonicotinoids, Bordeaux broth, glyphosate, copper lime broth, methyl mercury, growth regulators, seed dressing agents, and anti-emergence agents, etc., are particularly worthy of mention. The very bad DDT, which was used by the Americans in the last World War as a protection against malaria, and which is deposited in the environment and even accumulates to a great extent in natural foodstuffs, was banned in various Western industrialized countries from about 1970. As far as I know, since 2004, this poison may only be used worldwide to combat epidemics. But that does not make things any better, because this very dangerous toxin corresponds to a chemical that is extremely difficult to break down, which spreads over very wide areas of land and water and poisons everything, whereby it also enters the bodies of human beings via vegetarian food, as well as via water and the air we breathe, as it does in all other life forms, whereby the toxin accumulates in fatty tissue and causes suffering. The death of bees and the pollution of the environment are nowadays also publicly denounced in demonstrations, especially by juveniles and adults who are environmentally conscious. But in this respect, too, there is no useful reaction from anyone responsible for the world. Just as in this respect, no information is brought to bear on the fact that here, too, the whole evil is founded in overpopulation and its destructive machinations. This also applies to the ongoing destruction and extinction of biodiversity, whereby also the entire world of birds, mammals, animals, insects, amphibians, and reptiles are extremely endangered and partly already extinct or close to extinction. All the catastrophic machinations that exist are increasing and are being driven forward by overpopulation arise in relation to the growing population of the Earth, whereby these are very diverse and also so catastrophic because they are connected with the destruction of nature and the fauna and flora, and thus also with the extinction and destruction of biodiversity or biological diversity. But this is not enough, because fauna is also connected to this, which suffers immense damage. For example, in terms of the extinction of animals, birds, bees, and insects. Due to intensified and poisonous agriculture, various birds have lost their breeding places, such as skylarks, etc., but also animals such as roe deer, whose fawns normally lie in the tall grass, which is too often cut away, and the young animals are often killed by mowing machines. The populations of all honeybees and wild bees have also been endangered for a long time, because all fruit trees and flowering plants are sprayed with toxins and the bees are thus poisoned. Just as happens with all kinds of insects, some of which have already been practically wiped out by far more than 70%. And when I mention creatures such as arthropods and hexapods, as well as rock jumpers and fish, it is especially the flying insects that are on the brink of extinction. The arthropods are the most species-rich class of arthropods, and at the same time, with regard to their absolute majority, the most species-rich class of all living beings, whereby in the tropical rainforests and in all areas of the earth, millions of undiscovered genera and species still live, whose original emergence on Earth took place for the first time more than 470 million years ago, as Sfath explained. To my knowledge, as I learned from Sfath, so many millions of insect genera and species exist on Earth in total that about 75% of all wild life forms are insects. But they are being increasingly endangered by poison spraying, and very many are being driven to extinction. And this is happening through machinations that are the result of overpopulation, because their gigantic demand for food means that the entire diversity of all biological or vegetable foodstuffs can only be planted, grown, and brought to growth. Harvest and trade by spraying them with poisons that are harmful to the health of human beings, that cause suffering and disease and even death, and that accumulate in the plants. And this poison spraying is only done because only by eradicating the insects that have naturally attacked the food plants since time immemorial can the enormous, gigantic, and mass production of plant food production no longer be impaired. But the fact that in the process a great many vital insects and all kinds of other living creatures are killed and exterminated is of no concern to the poison mixer corporations, farmers or market gardeners, nor to private and amateur gardeners, nor to the large vegetable food cultivation corporations. And all this is happening through criminal and irresponsible as well as conscienceless machinations, which, as an inevitable consequence of food procurement, arise from the enormous mass of overpopulation, precisely in order to feed the 9 billion Earth humans, whereby, however, more and more land is being destroyed, and also very many vital living beings of all genera and species are being killed and exterminated. What millions of tons of toxins are produced annually by the global poison corporations and spread into nature by farmers, market gardeners, and large-scale industrial food crop producers in order to protect and make vegetarian food thrive is hardly comprehensible anymore. This, however, corresponds to an overpopulation machination by which not only nature is slowly but surely destroyed in its entirety, and all life of fauna and flora is affected in an ever more exterminating and destructive way, but also the whole of humanity, which feeds on all the vegetable food products produced. Just as the fauna and flora are poisoned by the toxins and fall ill or die from them, succumb to destruction and extinction. That is to say, both the plant and fauna life forms. This is also generally true worldwide for all Earth humans. All the vegetable foodstuffs absorb the many toxic substances applied to them, and are thus poisoned and then eaten by human beings, whereby the irresponsible manufacturers of the poisons, the chemists, poison companies, and also the health authorities, etc., consciencelessly and irresponsibly lie and deceive, and claim that a minimal amount of a few milligrams or micrograms of the toxins is harmless to human beings. The effective fact is, however, that the smallest amount, be it also only 1 milligram mg equals sign 1,000th of a gram equals sign 10 to 3g, or 1 microgram UG equals sign 1 millionth of a gram equals sign 10 to 6g, is detrimental to health. And indeed it is the case that already 1 nanogram Eng, or 1 billionth of a gram, is enough to cause any kind of suffering or serious illness, with various types of cancer being the most frequent, the worst, and thus the most deadly. However, neither the chemists who invent all the many kinds of poisons, nor the corporations that produce all the poisons, nor those who, greedy for money and profit, use and spread the poisons in order to gain enormous harvests and thus accumulate horrendous financial fortunes. The fact and truth is that everything is done to keep humanity alive and also to be able to supply its offspring, who continue to be born into the world irrationally, with food, along with everything else that is needed by the mass of every population in every country. But nothing of this is said to the ignorant juveniles demonstrating for a better climate and to the populations of all countries in general, because they remain stupid and ignorant and basically do not understand what they are demonstrating for. What must also be said is that with the current world population, it must be thoroughly considered that in order to feed it, a mountainous area is already needed, which, as you have calculated very precisely, corresponds to a planted area of around 20 million square kilometers. That is to say, as much as all of South America, the Ukraine, and Spain together have in square kilometers. And these 20 million square kilometers of soil area, naturally distributed over the whole world in terms of soils that can still be planted for natural food and are still fertile in a natural way, or that only produce poison-contaminated food plants through malicious, toxic chemistry, through which many human beings fall ill with cancer and other ailments, can only be calculated for the Earth humans' overpopulation. In addition, according to your calculations, there is a huge land area of about 31 million square kilometers, which is about the size of the whole of Africa and Germany, whereby this huge area is used exclusively for planting animal food. That is to say, for animals of various kinds, which are then slaughtered and whose meat is processed into human food, the skins into leather, the bones into fertilizer meal, etc., and the entrails into meat meal, etc. All this adds up to about 51 million square kilometers, which are needed to feed the almost 9 billion human beings on Earth today. Various countries, above all China, have been outsourcing their food production and other products of human need to other countries for decades, and have been leasing or buying their soils and land, because there is no longer any land available in their own countries on which food could still be grown and harvested, or on which animals could still be used for meat production, etc. And these countries include other countries as well as China. And these countries include Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, along with other European countries, which use the soils of foreign countries in this way and thus drastically stifle their own possibilities for growing vegetarian food, etc., and also poison the landscapes and their streams and other waters as well as the atmosphere. Of course, the indigenous populations themselves suffer because they can no longer grow their own plant-based food. But this means that many of the natives of such countries starve, and many also die of hunger. In this respect, there are currently around 900 million human beings worldwide who do not have enough food and are closer to death than to life. If they want to live, they have to buy the necessary food at a high price either from foreign rich states or from those who lease or buy their land and soil for their own food production, plant and plunder it, if they have the necessary financial means to do so at all, but this is usually not the case. Consequently, only the way to the grave remains open to them, precisely by starving to death. What has been made clear so far with what has been said, even if only in an incomplete way, because much more would have to be said about it. There are other disastrous machinations to be mentioned, which emerge as malicious and destructive consequences from the inexorably growing overpopulation. For example, it must be seen and understood that every year, not only tens of millions of new offspring are conceived and brought into the world without a second thought, as was the case in 2018 with more than 109 million, but also that every year around 100 million juveniles enter adulthood and begin to act as such. This means that these young people, at least a large proportion of them, carelessly take the right that is theirs and motorize themselves with a motorbike or a car that is undeniable. On the one hand, this increases the exhaust gases and the CO2 content worldwide by enormous tons from these explosive motor vehicles, and on the other hand, the atmosphere and thus also human health as well as the entire nature and its fauna and flora are dangerously impaired, even to the point of destruction, death, and annihilation and extinction. However, the explosion engine exhaust gases are only a part of the whole emission disaster, because this still lurks in many other things, which hardly any human being thinks about, such as in relation to the food, respectively the nourishment, which every earthling needs. The fact is that the production and processing of food also causes enormous tonnages of CO2, as well as other toxins that are harmful to health, but which are never mentioned by the sciences, and everything is kept quiet in this respect. And all these toxic emissions get into the atmosphere as well as through rain and snow into the soil, and thus also back into the plant foods in which the toxins also settle and are then eaten by human beings. When it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, we should not only think of transport with explosive motor vehicles, such as cars, buses, motorbikes, ships, and aeroplanes, etc., because the production and manufacture of food for earthly mankind must also be taken into account, which also produces huge amounts of greenhouse gases. Also the production of feed to feed all the huge masses of farmed animals, fish, poultry, and livestock, etc., which are kept, slaughtered, and produced for human meat consumption, are partly responsible for the greenhouse effect. And the food for earthly mankind contributes even much more and stronger to the fact that the greenhouse effect increases more and more violently with every new earthling that is born and drives the overpopulation even higher. So not only the endless columns of smoking cars, motorbikes, tractors, lorries, aeroplanes, ships, diesel trains, and other explosion engine vehicles, but also chimneys of human dwellings, power stations and factories, and many other exhaust gas guzzlers are to be named as causes of the greenhouse effect. And if this is considered, then, which must also be said in fairness, every juicy fruit, Every berry, every grain, and every vegetable is part of this, regardless of whether it is produced in a distant country or in one's own homeland. I would now like to say, if I remember the recent teaching correctly, that vegetables, berries and fruits, as well as all other vegetable foods, also become CO2 guzzlers if they are consumed outside the production and harvesting periods. And this is because their CO2 levels are increased by transport and storage on the one hand, but also by transport from the storage depots to the final sellers on the other. Then there is the further increase in CO2 due to the transport of the food to the buyer's home, as more greenhouse gases then develop during the preparation and cooking of the food, which means that more and more of these gases are produced than is the case with the mere consumption of fresh vegetables. Another thing is also to be addressed, which relates to vegetarianism and veganism, whereby stupid troublemakers weakly and nonsensically insult human beings who eat only plant food as herbivores, plant murderers and the like, just as they on the other hand idiotically insult meat eaters as animal murderers and so on. The fact is that some live their vegetarianism and veganism and others their omnivorous way of life, as it has been given to the human life form since time immemorial. Unfortunately, however, as a result of religious doctrines, lies, conspiracy theories, false information and false views, etc., the human beings of the earth have become deluded into believing that human beings should only consume plant foods and the like and not kill animals and therefore also not eat meat. And this happens because due to their ignorance, they cannot understand the natural creational laws and their effective naturalness, which is related to the fact that human beings are omnivores. I have a few explanatory things to say about this, which means that I am digressing somewhat from the actual topic, and must also make it clear that I am not taking sides with omnivores or meat eaters, nor with vegetarians and vegans, but am simply explaining what I am effectively explaining in terms of reality and its only truth. Omnivorousness and thus also meat eating, as well as vegetarianism and veganism, correspond to that which is also inherent in all the various life forms existing in the wild as well as adapted in the sphere of human beings, such as pigs, dogs, and many other living beings of all genera and species. Unfortunately, vegans and vegetarians as well as omnivores do not want or understand that they are following an unrealistic delusion, because they are not able to perceive reality and its truth, and therefore not able to comprehend it. Many of them have false views and opinions due to religious sectarian misguided beliefs, while others are not allowed to eat meat or vegetarian products due to intolerance or illness. Others, however, have an aversion to any vegetarian or meat food for undefinable reasons, or they resist consuming such food for reasons unknown to themselves. But vegetarianism, like veganism, is usually based on incorrect assessments of the laws of nature, as well as in stupid and mendacious new religious claims made up by fanatical delusionists, which they reinterpret through new interpretations of the Bible and other holy books. And it is precisely through this that the greatest lies, deceptions, and conspiracy theories arise, because in modern times scriptural falsifiers and conspiracy theorists also falsify and reinterpret the stupidities that lead earthlings astray and drive them crazy in the Christian Bible and other religious books. And so it happens also with regard to the Bible verse of Genesis 9:3, which is supposed to have been said by none other than God himself, which is of course absolute nonsense, but is supposed to have been stated, "Let everything that stirs and lives serve you for food. Like the green plants, I leave everything to you." But it may also happen as a result of false love of animals, etc., but also because it is lied about that a God has forbidden the eating of meat, as is claimed in modern times, for example, by the lying and all-twisting Bible falsifiers. Probably every Christian knows this moronic Bible verse, and it explains to everyone why human beings are allowed to eat meat and animal products. In the beginning, the relationship between God, human beings, and animals is said to have been harmonious and in harmony with each other, and life in paradise was full of peace. At least that is what the Bible suggests for its believers. Furthermore, the imaginary God is also said to have said to the human beings in Genesis 1:29-30, "For food I will give you the seeds of plants and the fruit that grows on trees, all over the earth." but to the land animals and to the birds and to everything that creeps on the ground, to all creatures that have the breath of life in them, I assign grasses and leaves for food. And if the Bible is considered further, then also the herald Emmanuel, who is slanderously called Jesus Christ and Son of God by the delusionists, taught other than a crazy prohibition of eating meat. He was neither the Son of God nor a vegetarian or vegan. This, however, in addition to monstrous lies, is also rightly stated in the Bible that he ate fish according to Luke 24:42-43, and also lamb according to Luke 22:8-15. Emmanuel also distributed fish and bread at the feeding of the alleged 5,000, where in reality and truth a group of only a few dozen human beings was present, and thus not 5,000 earthlings. In fact, only about 250 persons were present at this Sermon on the Mount and the multiplication of fish and bread, and only a few men were present, contrary to the claim of lies in John chapter 6 verse 10 in the New Testament. Mainly there were only women and children who listened to Emmanuel's explanations and also followed him up the mountain, which in reality was only a small hill. So the 5 barley loaves and the 2 fishes, which Emmanuel had multiplied by his powers of consciousness, were needed for only about 250 human beings, that is to say women and children as well as for 40 men, but not for their 5,000. Effectively, it would have been extremely strange if Emmanuel had been a vegetarian or vegan. Also in a vision of the Apostle Peter, it is explained in the New Testament that Emmanuel had declared all food to be pure, including the flesh of animals, as can be looked up in Acts 10:10-15. Even after the great flood at the time of Noah, the alleged God Creator gave permission to the human beings to eat meat, as also in Genesis 9:2-3. God never revoked this permission. Of course, these are only fables, but in this respect they are the oldest in the Christian world. But now in modern times they are falsified by sectarian and fanatical liars and conspirators and suggested to the delusional believers in God as the truth doctrine of a creator or God, who believe all this nonsense and fall for it unthinkingly. And this has been the case since time immemorial, also with regard to the vegetarianism and veganism of the Essenes, who were not early Christians but a religious group in ancient Judaism, while Christians, among others, have lied since time immemorial that they were early Christians, and that these first Christians were vegetarians because God wanted that animals should never be slaughtered and eaten. But these are nothing more than fables, lies and fantasies of earthlings who are under the delusion of God, because on the one hand there has never been a creator God. There is no creator God, and there never will be a creator God, because since the beginning of time only the creation of universal consciousness as pure spiritual energy has existed. It also exists in this way today and will exist in this way until the end of its time, until it changes and enters the next higher level absolute absolutum, as described in my explanations, origin of all existence. Now, why human beings kill animals, which they then eat for food? That was already the case from the very beginning of first human existence, because in a completely natural way, even primitive human beings were hungry and had to feed themselves. Consequently, they did the obvious thing and invented hunting animals, etc., hunted them, killed them, and ate their flesh. And since there were no religions, sects, cults, or delusions of God in prehistoric times, there was also no cry for early humans to consume meat. It was only when delusions about a higher might, and thus deities and religions were fantasized that Christianity in particular came up with the 10 Commandments, especially the 5th commandment, thou shalt not eat meat. When Christianity came along with the 10 Commandments, especially the 5th commandment, thou shalt not kill, which then gave rise to particularly strange murderous blossoms in Christianity, and continues to do so. Vegetarianism and veganism also came along, based on completely false and crazy delusions and delusion-related misunderstandings, which continue to persist delusionally to this day. And these delusions regarding a creator God, who is always imaginary in any case, having forbidden the killing of animals for food and the eating of their flesh, not only correspond to a conspiracy theory, but to a delusional misleading of the kind with regard to the believers in God's delusion, as well as to absolute imbecility and deceit. In fact, it was not the church holidays, such as Christmas as the festival of love, that invented meat eating, because meat consumption and delusion of God belong together in all religions from the beginning, whereby earth humans were also shaped in this respect, and animal sacrifices were offered to the imaginary gods, and goddesses in religious sectarian delusion of God, in addition to human sacrifices, in order to appease these allegedly wrathful deities. This is what happened in all ancient idolatrous cults, as well as in priestly Judaism and among the early Christians, from whom first Catholicism, and then, through the Reformation, Protestantism emerged. But everything happened equally in all religions, sects and cults, etc. In all religions and cults, it was the priests who, in addition to their delusion of God, also killed animals as butchers and disemboweled them on the altar with a knife, and then burned a certain part of them on the altar, while the rest of the meat was roasted and eaten. As a rule, the priests received the remaining and larger part, while a smaller third part was given to the person who paid or donated the sacrificial animal and gave it to the priest for slaughter. But what the delusional believers in God or the religious sectarian delusional earthlings are doing nowadays with the old word of the Hebrews, which has been distorted to the core by Christians, with "thou shalt not murder," from the 10 words that God spoke, which they falsify as the 5th commandment of the Bible, "Thou shalt not murder." This surpasses the worst frauds, falsifications, lies, and deceptions ever invented. Moreover, the whole of the converted reality and truth leads to the rampant delusions and mendacious and fraudulent consequences that cause misery and millions of deaths from starvation in the world, through the lie that human beings should not kill animals and eat their flesh. For the human beings of the earth, meat is a natural and precisely natural foodstuff, whereby the breeding of animals, livestock and feathers, etc., and thus the keeping of all the life forms that are to serve as food for human beings, are, however, to be cared for and treated cleanly, justly, correctly, and as living beings worthy of life. This, however, also refers to the entire plant world, for all the genera and species belonging to it are also living beings, which is why they also require the honor and dignity that must be accorded them. But now, in relation to the world of life forms which live in the wild or which are kept for slaughter for human food, no form of cruelty of any kind to animals, no crude ill treatment, no starvation or drought, etc. of animals, livestock, feathered fowl, and all other life forms of all genera and species shall be permitted. All life forms are, in the same way as the human beings, classified in life, and consequently, with increasing age, all of them become weaker physically, but also psychologically and in terms of consciousness, or instinctively, and die at some point. However, life requires all life forms, whether human beings, animals, birds and feathered creatures, insects, fish, amphibians and reptiles, etc., as well as all other living beings of all genera and species, to have their own food, be it vegetarian or carnal, because only by providing all of them with the nourishment to which they are entitled, and which is specifically geared to them, can it be prevented that an entire species does not die out after some time. Regardless of whether it is for human beings, animals, creatures, or plants, it is always, absolutely and inevitably necessary that their offspring or their descendants, after birth, are assigned to the new becoming and sprouting, etc., and thus grow up physically and become adults. According to the natural laws, it is inevitable that learning and thus knowledge is gained through experience and conscious thought, as is the case with human beings. This is in contrast to the functioning instincts of animals, feathered creatures, etc., which also give rise to affective feelings and, from these, to psychical impulses. This is especially the case with mammals of all genera and species, as well as with various animals and other life forms, just as it is with human beings, all of which can be affected by weak to strongest and deepest psychic impulses and can be moved to tears by joy, sadness and pain, just as human beings can. Consequently, in addition to the foodstuffs applicable to the life forms, the offspring must also be taken into consideration, for only if they can maintain their life and also provide for the necessary offspring will their species and kind be preserved. In human beings, many animals and many creatures, etc., living offspring are born, while other living beings lay eggs. Further, it is to be said that in the plant world, by the touch of insects and birds, etc., or by the wind for reproduction, etc., pollen from seed plants is dispersed, and other plants are also pollinated and thereby fertilized and stimulated to continue to exist, etc. However, whatever the details of reproduction look like, according to the laws of nature, all life forms of every species and kind need in their own special way their own appropriate food and their very own possibility of reproduction. On the one hand, to maintain their own life and to be able to live, and on the other hand, to ensure the survival and continued existence of their own species through offspring. In this context, it is also important that living beings, starting with human beings and including all animals, all creatures, the millions of insects, all feathered creatures, amphibians, fish, birds, and reptiles, etc., pass on their vital characteristics to their offspring through their genes/genetics, which is also the reason why many species can be assigned to certain genera. Human beings, as well as certain higher animal life forms, are also endowed with characteristics such as intelligence, but also, under certain circumstances, with a higher instinctual thought world, etc., which is also dependent on genes, among other things. As for human beings, breathing is necessary for all living things, from the smallest and tiniest to the largest life forms of all genera and species, which also includes the entire plant world. The human being, as well as all other living beings, needs oxygen in order to maintain the function of the cells, because without it no life form would be able to live, because its cells would immediately die. Human beings breathe through their lungs, as do animals and various creatures, etc., while fish have gills and air bladders for underwater breathing. Another form of respiration is skin respiration, which carries out gas exchange through the skin, which is also fundamentally the case with human beings, but is not sufficient to guarantee their life and survival, so skin respiration is only a helpful additional factor for them. Finally, it should be said that there are many ways of locomotion for all life forms: human beings, animals, amphibians, birds, bats, aquatic creatures and reptiles, etc. And in this respect, movements are of enormous importance. Depending on the genus and species, such as running, swimming, climbing, hopping, jumping, turning, flying, running, wiggling, and crawling. And this is also the case in the entire plant world, although the movements of plants are much slower than those of living creatures that are not stationarily bound to the ground but can move freely on their own legs over the ground or with wings through the air. The movements of plants, be they grasses, flowers or blossoms, mosses, fungi or lichens, etc., take a long time and cannot usually be perceived by the human eye and its other senses, except when the plants are moved by winds, such as leaves, stalks, plant shoots and reeds, etc., the rising and blossoming of flowers and blossoms or the like. However, takes a long time and can only be perceived and seen by the human being through long-time cinematic slow-motion recordings, and by looking at the recordings later, whereby, in general, all their movements are designed for their physique and oriented towards their living environment, which precisely demands certain possibilities of movement from them. Whereby, in this respect, the moment of stimulus must also be taken into account, because in every respect all living beings react completely differently to different stimuli. Therefore, it is to be said in this respect that every life form has its individual characteristics, such as the human being who can see, hear, smell, and taste, as a result of which, but only when he perceives something in his environment, such as a certain smell, he is struck by a stimulus perception, which in this case happens precisely through the nose, which then perceives these stimuli. Effectively, it is absolutely vital for human beings, as well as for all animals, all creatures, and all living beings in general, and thus also for the entire plant world, to be able to perceive stimuli and react to them. But I think I have now said enough in this matter and have also digressed somewhat, which is why I want to return to the fifth commandment in Christianity to, "Thou shalt not kill." This commandment corresponds to a very early fraudulent falsification and false translation by Christians in relation to the sixth commandment of Judaism, or the words, "Thou shalt not murder," from the 10 words spoken by God. These alleged words of God were already known to the ancient Hebrews as Noachide words, which also found their way into the first Torah of the ancient Hebrews and were inserted into it. However, this actual first Torah was then destroyed by a conflagration, but was then restored in a postscript, namely as the second Torah. The second Torah was written by several scribes and scribes. Quetzal gave an explanation of this in 1986, which I will search out and append to my words. So I will only say in this regard that in the first Torah, the sixth commandment from the 10 words that God spoke, referred to the fact that any direct or indirect killing of an innocent human being was not permitted, and was expressed with the words, "You shall not murder." Should it happen, however, that an innocent human being was killed, then this meant nothing other than murder, following which the original text, the 10 words spoken by God of the old Hebrew commandment was later, because, as explained, the first Torah of the ancient Hebrews had fallen victim to a conflagration, inserted in the postscript of the second created Torah, and with it also the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not murder."
Pleiadian Player and Contact Reports, Volume 5, page 185, 212th Contact, Thursday, the 6th of November, 1986.
It is to be noted that of Emmanuel's disciples only Judas Iscariot core. Correct. Iscarioth really knew how to read and write, for he was what nobody knew, and therefore was not handed down. A scribe who, however, reneged on his profession and became a follower of Emmanuel. As has been shown by many years of investigation, which our scientists and historians have also carried out through time travel, it is to be explained that already at the first time of the emergence of Christianity, the disciples and evangelists, etc., were anxious to give the impression that they were knowledgeable in reading and the scriptures, and were therefore much more highly educated than the common people. This was because the common human beings of the people were of the mistaken opinion that those who were more highly educated than others knew and understood more, and were therefore also competent and authorized to instruct the more ignorant and uneducated people. An erroneous evil that has persisted on earth to this day among all the peoples of the earth, which is why the human beings of today are also still of this erroneous opinion. Because of this, as in those days, the human beings are faithful to titles and offices and allow themselves to be oppressed, exploited, or simply held down by those who have rank and name and occupy offices. It is still the same today as it was in the time of Emmanuel and the prophets of old. And just to these it is to be said that not one of them has written down his teaching or his story. In fact, this was done by others, who were instructed to do so by those who knew the scriptures. This resulted in the first Torah, which was later destroyed by a great fire down to the last letter, so that there were no longer any written records, and everything was only handed down from mouth to mouth for generations. Of course, the consequence of this was that an enormous number of falsifications arose, until one day 12 self-proclaimed prophets of their own grace gathered around them a whole number of people who knew the scriptures and went out with them to a remote region, where they lived for 40 days in a meager form, and during this time wrote down 240 books, from which, in the course of time, the new Torah came into being, from which the Bible of Christianity also emerged, to which the New Testament was then simply added.
Already in the ancient Hebrews it was clearly expressed and stated, "Thou shalt not murder." Consequently, there was never any talk of "thou shalt not kill," which the delusional Christian world, however, as a result of the deceitful and falsifying translators of the word in their delusion, also wrongly implements and delusionally accepts as truth, namely in the way that no animals, no beasts, no feathered fowl and creeps, etc., or other lowly creatures and animals used for human food purposes should be killed. or other lowly creatures that might be useful for human food should be killed, and their flesh should not be eaten. And such lowly life forms ultimately include also mealworms, etc., as well as caterpillars, beetles and all notches of all genera and species, etc. It is impossible to explain the effective reality and its truth to all God delusionists and religion delusionists and to all other earthlings who have eaten themselves into a delusion of faith. All human beings who are under a delusion of faith, whatever their delusion may be, are so dominated by their faith that they cannot perceive the effective reality of fact and the only truth that emerges from it. As a result of the prevailing inability to absorb, reflect and consider, and in the absence of the ability to judge and form opinions, it is absolutely impossible for every delusional human being to perceive the effective reality and the truth given in it alone, because their intellect, reason, and intelligence are blocked and consequently cannot be touched. The natural creational laws are geared to the fact that every life form must eat food, because only in this way can it maintain its body and its life, whereby it is also predetermined by the natural creational laws that since time immemorial, and thus since the emergence of living beings, all genera and species have been geared to certain forms of nutrition. Repeating this for the umpteenth time, it is to be said that every life form is oriented in a special way with regard to its food. Consequently, it is also predetermined by these laws that certain life forms feed mainly on plants, others as good as only on meat or blood, while omnivores feed, nourish, feed, and satiate themselves with both plant and meat food. But as far as greenhouse gases are concerned, which, through the machinations of overpopulation, have led to climate change that can no longer be stopped, the reality and truth is that both the clearing of the Earth's soil for planting, production and harvesting, as well as the resulting processing, are already causing climate change, as well as the processing of the vegetable foodstuffs, the transport, then also the food preparation and the disposal of the waste products of the foodstuffs produce enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. Namely, at present more than 33% of the total exhaust emissions, as I know from the Plejarin calculations. And if we consider the entire food requirement of the Earth humans in terms of food alone, then in addition to CO2, which is produced in large quantities, there are also nitrous oxide and methane gas, which are produced in particular by the digestive waste gases of the cattle that provide meat for the food of Earth humans. If my memory serves me correctly, I can cite what I have recently learned from Plejarin calculations regarding the percentages of all greenhouse gases produced by meat, eggs, all dairy products, bread, potatoes, wheat, baked goods, herbs and berries and fruits. However, I still find this percentage extremely alarmingly high. But what is even more important is the preparation of food for cooking, which also leads to an enormous increase in the total mass of greenhouse gases, which is further increased with every newborn human being. The production of meat as food for the ever-increasing overpopulation, which today already amounts to more than 17 times more than would be correct for a planet like the Earth in purely natural terms, namely 529 million, causes the greatest and most serious problems with regard to the greenhouse effect. This is because the production for the feed of all animals, birds and feathered fowl, etc. alone requires a huge cultivation area of about 31 million square kilometers, which is about the size of the whole of Africa and Germany together. And on top of that, everything is connected with an enormous effort that creates huge amounts of greenhouse gases, for example in relation to the production of butter, yogurt, cheese, curd and cream. The biggest problem in this respect, however, is the methane gas emissions associated with cow husbandry, as is also the case with pure cattle husbandry for slaughter for human meat. And the fact that the animals in the entire livestock and feathered fowl are kept and treated miserably and irresponsibly is much more than just criminal towards these life forms, which cannot defend themselves and have to suffer unspeakable physical and psychological pain because their keepers, breeders and butchers, etc., brutally and blasphemously torture them to death as a result of their human degenerations and lack of ethics and morals. Ever since the beginning of industrialization, the Earth's atmosphere has been steadily more affected by toxic emissions, for the entire Earth's atmosphere has since changed its composition so enormously due to greenhouse gases that the climate has thus changed in a catastrophically negative way, bringing ever worse natural disasters that cause immense destruction and steadily claim more human lives. Due to the burning of fossil fuels such as coal, gas, and oil, enormous concentrations of various greenhouse gases have developed, such as the colorless nitrous oxide or dinitrogen monoxide Wikipedia, gas from the group of nitrogen oxides, chemical sum formula N2O. In older literature, equals sign nitrous oxide, nitrogen oxidule, as well as methane, which is emitted in particular by the gigantic masses of cattle that serve as human meat food. However, as a result of global warming, methane gas is also released from the soil of northern regions, which has been frozen for thousands of years, as well as from the rock of the high mountains and from the seabed, so that in this way too, in addition to all the nature-destroying criminal and felonious machinations of overpopulation, greenhouse gases are massively and strongly increased. Although there is a completely natural greenhouse effect, the entire man-made developments in this respect through the irresponsible machinations of overpopulation are inexorably further intensifying the destructive process in the Earth's atmosphere and in terms of measurable warming. Earth humans, however, care little about the noticeable change in the climate, because nothing is being done to introduce a worldwide birth stop and worldwide birth control to stem the overpopulation growth and to do what could still prevent the foreseeable worst. All around, in all governments, environmental protection organizations, climate researchers, all groups and associations, etc. that deal with the world, the climate and environmental pollution, etc., only stupid, silly speeches are made, idiotic and impracticable as well as useless. Proposals are made, and imbecilic projects are thought up that can never bring any benefit. All the plans and projects fantasized by pompous experts are usually not even a drop of water on a hot stone, because the crazy ideas regarding the equally crazy plans and projects have already evaporated before they are even thought through to the end. And this is precisely because at the time of the irrational, nonsensical, absurd, paradoxical and incomprehensible as well as foolish, irrational and absurd development of ideas as well as plans and projects, overpopulation has already increased by many millions of human beings and, in addition, tens of millions of human beings are coming of age and demanding their rights, as a result of which old and new machinations, precisely due to the excess of overpopulation, make everything even worse and destroy all ideas, plans and projects before they can even be implemented in reality. But you have to be an academic, a researcher, a scientist, a government official or a doctor and professor in order not to recognize the effective reality of reality and its truth in absolute stupidity, self-importance and in roaring megalomania, and thus to disregard what could ultimately still be done to be able to prevent the worst. Nothing is being done against the unstoppable growth of overpopulation, and thus nothing is being done with regard to all the criminal, irresponsible machinations that are increasingly emerging from the mass of Earth humans, which are increasing more and more in relation to the annual overpopulation growth, and are increasing all the already horrendous problems more and more. All the many tens of millions of newly born Earthlings and the 18-year-olds who leave their parents' home and become independent every year need more and more new living space, which has to be created for them, whereby for decades more and more fertile land has to be built up with houses, necessary production facilities, factories, roads, and paths. As a result, the land that is most urgently needed for the cultivation of food crops is concreted over, sealed with asphalt and built over, which means that the food industry has to give up the processing of natural plant-based foods, as well as the farmers and gardeners who can no longer plant and grow vegetarian products because they lack the land to do so. This means that the large industrial food corporations will have their way, producing only purely chemical foodstuffs that no longer contain any natural plant substances, but only pure chemicals, artificial flavorings, and, in addition, many kinds of toxins that are harmful to health, as is already the case today in many respects. But the people do not know this, because they are naive and disinterested in buying and consuming everything without informing themselves about what they are buying and eating at exorbitant prices and, moreover, are contracting diseases, especially various forms of cancer, through this consumption of chemical and toxic food. The irresponsible machinations carried out by overpopulation, however, go in many other directions even further than all that has been said so far, because another machination results from the irresponsible worldwide pollution of the environment. Through this, fields, meadows, gardens, wetlands, mountains, moors, swamps, forests, and even primeval forests, as well as footpaths, rest areas, paths and roads, railway tracks, airfields in the seas, lakes, streams and rivers, etc., are polluted with thousands of tons of waste and many kinds of rubbish, especially with plastic and other plastics of all kinds. On the one hand, these pollutants affect the soil, the oceans and freshwaters, in which they are eventually crushed into microscopically small particles, after which they are absorbed or distributed by food plants via rainwater. Solar radiation and winds and human beings are also contaminated by the aquatic and terrestrial organisms that serve them as food, and then fall ill as a result of the toxins stored in these foodstuffs. The effective fact is that as a result of rampant overpopulation, climate-destroying machinations and greenhouse gases are steadily increasing, so too through the cultivation of food crops, their care, harvesting, processing and transport, and so on. It is also a fact that many kinds of poisons are spread, scattered and sprayed on and in these natural foodstuffs, as well as in the entire plant world. And this is done worldwide, especially by the farms, small and large market gardens, and the industrial food plant corporations, which plant soil and land in order to grow vegetal plants for the trade. In this poison spreading, which applies to all plants occurring in nature, but especially to all vegetal crops that ultimately serve as human food. That is to say, all tea, fruit, leaf, beet, berry, tuber, herb, maize, grain, and fruit crops, as well as nightshade plants, etc. Everything is poisoned with substances that are harmful to health. These poisons penetrate deep into the leaves, tubers, roots, fruit flesh, etc. of the cultivated products and are deposited, whereupon they are eaten by human beings as necessary food products, whereby many fall ill, are constantly and persistently wasting away, and are finally, in the worst case, stricken with cancer. On the one hand, this is said because, on the other hand, greenhouse gases and enormous environmental pollution are also caused by the above-mentioned factors of overpopulation. And environmental pollution is not only caused by the careless and thoughtless throwing away of waste and various other rubbish in the open countryside, no matter where, whether on roads and paths, fields, meadows, forests, sports schoolyards, or anywhere else, where the winds then blow away much of it and rain masses wash it all away, which then finds its way into fresh waters, streams, lakes, and rivers, and finally into the oceans. In this respect, it is the many different plastics, especially plastic, which is the greatest evil of all plastics. The first plastic ever developed in the new modern age, from 1905 to 1907, was invented after 2 years of research by an American-Belgian whose name unfortunately escapes me. After 2 years of research, he invented the first plastic product that could be thermoformed from a compound of phenolic resin and formaldehyde that he had put together. He called his invention Bakelite, which proved to be the first mass plastic that was light, cheap, hygienic, and durable, and consequently also quickly spread and found almost endless uses. The development of Bakelite was only the beginning of today's plastic industry, whereby, especially from the World War 1939 to 1945, many newer and improved plastics were developed, which still today show a great variety. In my boyhood and youth, Bakelite was an extremely popular plastic that served many purposes, but today it is a material that has a certain cult status and is much sought after as a collector's item. Nowadays, plastics are largely produced synthetically, mainly from unsaturated hydrocarbon compounds, with crude oil being the most commonly used raw material in plastic synthesis, along with natural gas and coal. In principle, the term plastic is the most common term for plastics of all kinds, although nowadays these are synthetic or semi-synthetic and are produced from the raw material petroleum, as I also said, but are also produced as solids by modifying natural polymers. Well, the fact is that for decades now, Plastic as waste has increasingly become a danger to the whole of nature, its fauna and flora, and also to the human beings of the earth itself as a result of criminal and irresponsible machinations that arise as a consequence of ever more massive overpopulation. And this danger is growing especially in the oceans and in all freshwaters, because the ever-increasing dumping of waste in nature, especially plastic and other plastics of all kinds, in addition to chemical toxins, cause the greatest evils. These not only poison all waters, but also aquatic life, which, in addition to larger plastic particles, also ingest the tiniest plastic particles that are created by the abrasion of the plastic waste. And these finest and tiniest plastic particles get into the flesh of the aquatic life forms, which then, when these life forms are caught, serve as food for the human beings, causing them health problems and damage. But the plastic waste as a whole also causes other damage that has tremendously serious consequences, which on the one hand can no longer be overlooked, and on the other hand can also no longer be recognized, assessed, or understood by so-called experts. On the other hand, it is already to the point that the resulting and further damage can no longer be managed. Everywhere in the still, free nature, in fields and meadows, in forests, meadows, waters, and also in residential areas, plastic waste lies and floats in the waters or flies around through the wind. The production and use of plastics of all kinds is an unstoppable and unmanageable environmental disaster that is becoming more and more rampant and cannot be stopped as long as overpopulation continues, grows and requires these plastics. And the Earthlings will not be able to get rid of this huge problem and the problems it causes, because no matter where, there are scraps of plastic, large or small or tiny plastic particles everywhere, which cause damage and destruction to nature and its fauna and flora, but also cause health problems for the human beings themselves. And this is also the case when it is mistakenly thought that some consumer product, an area, a body of water, a forest, a soil or a field or an area, etc., is free of plastic, because this is not the case, or only extremely rarely the case, because in reality and truth the plastic can often just not be seen. Just as the waves in the oceans and fresh waters rub and grind down the plastic waste and all other waste deposits, this is also the result of the winds in the great outdoors. This is because the loose plastic waste masses are blown and driven through the areas by the winds and, over time, are crushed and ground down to the tiniest particles on rocks, trees, buildings and bushes, etc. These are then distributed by the winds into the smallest of microscopic particles. These are then dispersed by the winds in the atmosphere and are inhaled by human beings and all living creatures with the air, causing damage to their health. But that's not all, because these tiny plastic particles, which can only be seen under a microscope, are also contaminated with toxic substances that are irresponsibly spread in nature, and which also settle as tiny particles on and in plants of all kinds. So also in food plants, which human beings and other living beings then feed on, and thus also cause themselves suffering and diseases of this kind. A fact that is of course vehemently denied by all experts and scientists, as well as by the plastics and chemical companies and all users of plastics and poisons. This also includes the entire earthly overpopulation, many of whom use synthetic clothing, dishwashing sponges and shower foams, etc., which wash out tiny plastic particles when used, which then end up in sewage treatment plants, but where the fibers and microplastic particles find their way down streams and rivers and are washed into the sea because they are too tiny to be filtered out. More than 40 million tons of such substances end up in the oceans worldwide every year, in addition to everything else that is disposed of in the wild. But this mass increases and grows every year in relation to the growing overpopulation, and with every new earthling that is born. If we look at the future of the Earth and its humanity, everything looks extremely bleak, even if the production of plastic and other synthetic materials changes for the better. Because if overpopulation and its machinations with regard to environmental pollution through poisons, greenhouse gases of all kinds, plastic waste and other plastic waste, as well as other waste and consumer products that are harmful to the climate, the spreading of poisons in nature and the building up of fertile land and soil, etc., are not finally stopped, then we will have to stop. If we do not finally put a stop to this, then not only humanity, but also the planet Earth itself will be inexorably doomed. Not only the production of all destructive things contributes to this, but above all their use in terms of personal use. In particular, however, industrial use is to be mentioned in this respect, such as especially for heat insulation, textile fibers, adhesives, packaging, cosmetics, etc., whereby these plastics are largely produced synthetically, as I have already said, mainly from unsaturated hydrocarbon compounds, whereby for the synthesis of plastics, in addition to natural gas and coal, crude oil is most frequently used as the basic raw material. And as I have already said, tiny plastic particles enter the human body through the flesh of marine and freshwater creatures, but also through land creatures, which individual human beings can do next to nothing about. This is because the problem must be tackled fundamentally in such a way that overpopulation is rigorously reduced and brought to a level suitable for the planet, by which alone all degenerations can be reduced and stopped, namely by an appropriate birth stop lasting several years, which under certain circumstances, because everything is already catastrophically far advanced, must be repeated once or twice in the course of time, after which worldwide birth control becomes a necessity. This had to be said once. Further, it is to be said elsewhere that the whole criminally overpopulated Earth and its humanity will be disproportionately affected by climate change, with effects on the whole environment, economy, and society, whereby in the long run all the bad, negative, and evil consequences will clearly outweigh all the good and positive. The whole global environmental problem is so multifaceted that it is no longer manageable for the entire army of loud-mouthed, wordy and big-talking and pompous people, even if they are concerned with things like the climate, environmental protection, nature conservation and food production, etc., with their stupid speeches, ideas, plans and projects. They clearly prove that they do not understand anything about the whole thing. Consequently, in their narrow-mindedness, they also neither recognize nor understand reality in relation to reality and its truth. So they crawl away cowardly behind their moronic and useless ideas, plans and projects, and do not come to the conclusion that at least a 7-year worldwide and rigorous birth stop and a following worldwide exactly precise birth control is the still only solution to counteract all future threatening and much worse becoming catastrophes. Climate change and all the resulting destructive natural disasters and their consequences are the greatest global environmental problem ever triggered by Earth humans, which stands in the context of immense overpopulation. In this context, the experts with doctoral and professorial titles, who, in their loud-mouthedness, their megalomania and their arrogance, throw around effectively stupid ideas and imbecilic plans and projects, and think they are the greatest geniuses, cannot bring any valuable resolutions or solutions. This means that all the problems of the slow but sure destruction of nature, its fauna and flora, the climate, the seas and fresh waters, the forests and primeval forests, meadows and fields, etc., will continue and ultimately bring about the downfall of a large part of earthly humanity. So one day the whole thing will come to a miserable end, because the total destruction caused by the irresponsible machinations of overpopulation in nature, its fauna and flora, the climate and the whole planet itself will be unstoppable. The efforts for an internationally coordinated approach should therefore be of enormous importance for the whole world, by the whole mass of overpopulation as well as by the big-talking experts of the environmental protection agencies, the governments, and other manifold offices and authorities. But it is not enough for the so-called experts to occupy themselves with questions and moronic solutions and plans for climate change, because all their stupid doings and plotting, etc., do not take into account the meaning and purpose of it all. They are simply incapable of thinking in a logical way themselves, of sorting out the important things that arise, and of drawing the correct and logical conclusions, of acting and putting them into practice. And this is a fact, as it is also the case with the majority of the ruling powers, who are effectively incapable of their office and therefore have to call in external advisors, who are paid for by the taxpayers. This is because, as a result of their inability to manage the state, regardless of the state's affairs, The majority of state leaders are ignorant losers or state powers who have no experience for their office, do not see through the important interrelationships, and are naive and stupid. Their stupid, senseless talk, as presented in the public media, in writing in newspapers and in speeches on television, is more than just blatantly stupid, meaningless, and proves their incompetence to the point of ridiculousness. Their work, which they should be doing for the good of the state, the citizenry and the whole society, the nation, nature, fauna and flora, and the planet itself, etc., is equivalent to factors that are not in their interest, corresponds to factors that are, on the one hand, self-centered, self-important, arrogant, and, on the other hand, megalomaniac, remote from the people and completely insane, racist and more than seldom stupid. See in this respect, for example, in the USA, the oaf Trump, who is cheered on by all those from the people who, in terms of intelligence, are just as vastly inferior as he is. Those few, however, who are good and responsible as governments, researchers and scientists, etc., and who want to effectively do something for the good of the people, for freedom, peace, the preservation of nature, its fauna and flora, and the entire planet as a result of their intellect, their reason, their intelligence, and their sense of responsibility are simply disregarded and cut off by the co-governors, co-researchers, and co-scientists. And these others, who are unfit and riveting in their offices, have to get help from advisors and populists for all kinds of ideas and decisions and for all their tasks, in order to even be able to give themselves the appearance of being a government official, a researcher, or a scientist. The whole thing also leads, especially in politics, to certain unfit state leaders being replaced by other state leaders, etc., from other states that are a little cleverer. They sign treaties through which they, together with the stupid part of the people and their roaring pro and hurrah for subjugation by a foreign state entity, place their own country and its entire population under the thumb of foreign states. For example, under the violence of the freedom-hostile EU dictatorship. Here, however, I must deviate from the actual topic, because politics is also connected with everything, about which there are various important things to be said, about which I also want to say a few things in relation to Switzerland, because these things concern me as a Swiss citizen and taxpayer. The indisputable fact is that only very few of those in power are really educated in governance, but are only concerned with their own well-being and woe, which is why they are not only concerned in their office with the security, peace, effective freedom and well-being of their own country and its people, and that they do not have any interests in mind, but only their own well-being, etc., is also proven by them in governmental negotiations, speeches, hearings, statements, and in resolutions and votes, to which they vote yes or no, depending on the trend, without knowing and understanding what the voting proposal is about at all. The fact is, as I have often observed around the world, unfortunately also in Switzerland, that during such state-related necessities, some parliamentarians either doze off or sleep in their chairs, reading newspapers, magazines, or other non-factual material, or examine their laptops. As a result, they hear and understand nothing of all the important things the speakers have to say and explain. What they are interested in is only their attendance fee and the horrendous remuneration for their parliamentary office, but not the facts and opinions, etc., of the speakers and the interpretations of other parties. Explanation: Swiss Parliament. The Swiss Parliament has its seat in the Federal Palace in Bern and corresponds to the legislature at the federal level, =legislative Gewalt, legislation, legislative assembly. Of course, I only want to state facts in my remarks concerning Switzerland and not attack those persons by name, etc., who, in my opinion, are incompetent rascals or even ridiculous figures in their offices, just as I do not want to question the laws and order of Switzerland, because I find them absolutely in order and right, and only through them can peace, freedom, justice, and the law be comprehensively preserved. In fact, in every state there are only a few persons in all government offices who are capable of running the state and who also actually exercise their respective office responsibly and have the flair and the ability to do so. On the contrary, however, the others, that is to say those who are not like-minded, oppose them and do not allow them to have their say, as a result of which their efforts for the comprehensive good of the state and the people are not admitted but completely disregarded. Those, however, who make an honest effort to preserve freedom, peace, and their own laws and rights for their own country, and people are simply sidelined, ultimately voted out of office, and thus removed from office. And this is also what happened in Switzerland with federal councillor Christoph Wolfram Bloscher, who was voted out as federal councillor through a devious plot. And this is what happened in Switzerland, which prides itself on its neutrality, peace, freedom, and justice. But in the background, certain elements in party circles are clearly carrying out dishonest machinations with dictatorial overtones. And this has led to the fact that in the end, because he was completely inconvenient for certain people and had committed some mistakes for which he was not forgiven, a plot was forged and carried through against Christoph Bloscher, and he was voted out of office. So it also happens in Switzerland that disagreeable people are kicked out of the government, driven out, or simply voted out of office if they really care about the freedom, peace, and justice of the country and its people and want to prevent Switzerland and its people from having their freedom, peace, law, and legislation, and thus also justice, restricted by deceitful treaties such as with the EU dictatorship, and falling under the bailiwick of the European Union dictatorship. Furthermore, it is also to be mentioned in this regard that in governments in which there are righteous persons capable of running the state, who show good and valuable abilities and successes in the areas of government assigned to them and make righteous efforts to do everything, these are attempted to be eliminated by counter-minded people, or their work and efforts are nullified. Therefore, when there are good people in governments who do their best for the country and the people, everything they have achieved in good and best successes is ruined by those incompetent co-governors who interfere stupidly everywhere with their stupid mouths and make stupid demands because they are absolute losers as a result of envy, malice, ignorance, unreasonableness, incompetence, or sheer imbecility, who never really do anything good and reasonable in their lives. Consequently, they also do not achieve any successes. So it is these failures in the governments who are responsible for the fact that those who can effectively govern are disregarded, suppressed, and prevented from always doing the very best for the country and the people in every respect. As a result, the good forces, or those capable of governing, cannot penetrate and do anything valuable for the country and the people, because fundamentally they or their good, positive and reasonable efforts and successes are simply sawed off by the incompetent co-governors, as is also the case in Switzerland, and on which I would like to say something further. This is because exactly in this regard an unbelievable thing full of stupidity and idiocy arises, which relates to the Federal Council's financial administration, whereby Federal Councillor Willy Maurer, as your clarifications in December 2018 have shown, as Minister of Finance has achieved a surplus of billions, which according to logic, reason, rationality, and the intelligent should be used to reduce the national debt, which at the present time, as far as I know, still amounts to about 100 billion Swiss francs. However, instead of further reducing the debt, various would-be bigwigs from the parties and the public media, who are mentally deficient, are coming up with imbecilic airs that on the one hand, the surplus of billions should be squandered for various other purposes, while on the other hand pathologically imbeciles are claiming in the Polit blog, Switzerland has too little debt. This is followed by the equally absolutely idiotic attempt to explain, without debt, there is no prosperity, and a debt-free state is a bad state. This because a debt-free state would make fiscal policy goals absolute, and other tasks of the public sector would be neglected, such as investment in infrastructure. This would also include expenditures such as for general security, social equalization in education, etc., whereby such expenditures would usually have a positive economic effect in the long term because they would also stimulate general growth, which is also the reason why Switzerland's current prosperity is solely the result of the traditional debt economy that has been practiced by Switzerland since time immemorial. What is thought and done by the majority of those in power, all those responsible for the state, all the municipalities and the media with regard to debt management is completely idiotic, crazy, and also rubs off on the population. So the state administration serves as an example to the people with regard to debt making, and promotes the huge mountains of debt among the population, which at the present time amount to about 12 billion Swiss francs, which bring a lot of suffering and misery, and which amount to just 12% of what the national debt with its 100 billion, which as far as I know is currently paying 1% interest per year, is worth. In fact, contrary to the bullshit views and claims that debt is good and will stimulate the economy, etc., the opposite is true, because even low debt is never good, and high debt even less so. Debt of any kind and amount, except for limited, risk-free mortgages that can be canceled and repaid at any time for absolutely safe purposes, uses invariable low interest rates, creates severe constraints, and also imposes enormous interest rates, which inevitably eats into and overburdens any budget. This impairs and makes impossible all the plans and estimates of income and expenditure that have been drawn up, and thus also very massively impairs the financial resources available to the state administration and the municipalities. But there is also the debt creation of the population, which in this respect takes an example from the state administration, which creates debt upon debt, whereby many citizens spend more financial resources in the private sector than there are available funds for certain expenditures. Inevitably, this overburdens and completely exhausts any budget, which then inevitably tempts people to incur debt, more and more frequently, and more and more. This continues until the debt burden and the interest accruing on it reach dimensions that can no longer be paid, which ultimately leads in many cases to personal bankruptcy, and in small and medium-sized enterprises to business bankruptcy, resulting in empty pawn tickets. If we look at Switzerland's debt enforcement and bankruptcy statistics, Betreibungen und Konkurse Bundesamt für Statistik, Debt Enforcement and Bankruptcy, Federal Statistical Office, the result for the past year 2018 is frightening, as 4,813 Swiss companies went bankrupt. It was even worse in 2017, as there were 13,257 openings of company and private bankruptcy proceedings recorded according to the federal law on debt collection and bankruptcy, whereby bankruptcy proceedings in cases of company dissolution due to deficiencies in the organization art. 731 BCO are not included in this figure. When I look at the current figures from the Federal Statistical Office, such as this one, which I found on the internet, they show something extremely alarming and unpleasant, because for the year before last, 2017 alone, the figures on the development of bankruptcy proceedings in Switzerland show that in no previous year were so many company and private bankruptcy proceedings opened, namely a total of 3,257 bankruptcy proceedings. However, if we add to this the approximately 2.9 million debt collection proceedings and the debt ratio among private households, which currently amounts to over 40%, then I think this can be described as absolutely irresponsible on the part of all those involved in this debt ratio. In my further opinion, these are extremely sobering figures in terms of debt collection and bankruptcies, and absolutely not marginal phenomena, but figures that continue to rise and become more and more precarious. In this respect, Geneva alone shows a particularly high increase of 7% in private and corporate bankruptcies. But Zurich, a financial center worth billions, has also not been and will not be spared from the negative development. With regard to debt collection, an increase of 1.2% was registered in Zurich, with a total of 2617 bankruptcies threatened, opened, or executed in the city districts. In addition, the statistical yearbook of the city of Zurich shows 122,280 debt collections, while for the whole of Switzerland a total of 2,930,009 payment orders regarding debt collection actions and 1,710,834 seizures were executed. What resulted as losses from bankruptcies added up to 1.6 billion Swiss francs. If I now want to go further into debt making, it must be said that debts once made and unpaid continue to exist even if a blank pawn ticket is issued, which has a 20-year term, meaning that creditors can make renewed efforts to collect the debt at any time during this period. But this is also not the end of an empty pawn ticket, but rather the misery of debt can continue for debtors for their entire lives under certain circumstances. This is precisely because, according to the law, The term of an empty pawn ticket of 20 years is extended by another 20 years if, before the expiry of the respective expiry date of 20 years, the debt settlement or the payment of the debt is insisted on again in writing. And this can be repeated after another 20 years. In this way, even after 70 or more years, ancient debts can become current again, become a burden and be collected by creditors, regardless of whether the debtor is 50 or 70 years older and has become a pensioner, or has even become a burden on the Social Security office, etc. And the hammer in all this is that debts do not necessarily have to remain with the creditors, but that IOUs and empty mortgage bonds can be bought up by collection agencies for low amounts, which then go after the debtors, harass them incessantly and demand the entire high debt amounts, even if they have only paid a pittance for the empty mortgage bonds. And such debt collection companies practically never rest and may also resort to unlawful machinations, which in some form or other offend against every honor and dignity of being human and can even be violent, as is the case especially in Germany and other countries. All around, therefore, more money is spent than is earned, even in the private sphere. The fact is that in the citizenry, debt-making is becoming ever more blatant, precarious and extended, precisely also as a result of the false example of debt-making by the state leadership, whereby much more money is spent than is earned. Basically, financially everything and anything in every respect should only be geared to absolute security and handled in such a way that something, whatever it may be, is only tackled, created, produced, acquired, built, bought, or carried out if the necessary financial means are available in full, and everything can be paid in full without delay. This is the only way that neither debts nor any other financial problems arise, and in addition, the freedom of action. The independence as well as the security of the state and the people are secured, never to fall into debts and horrendous, useless, and loss-making interest payments, also on a purely private basis. However, all those who incur debts do not come to this insight, consequently also not those who govern the state, those who lead the municipalities and the media, but above all also not the people who are getting more and more into debt, and who take their debt-incurring government, and those who lead the municipalities as an example, because quite obviously their intelligence is not sufficient to understand this. Financial jugglers, bankers, media, financial administrators, brokers and other profiteers, etc., are generally making up something dubious with debt creating and, at the same time, with allegedly great profit-generating false promises in order to beguile their clueless customers, to mislead them, and to get their money. And it is particularly easy for them to do this because the majority of all earthlings are anxious to get a lot of money or even great wealth quickly instead of living modestly with what the remuneration from their daily work provides for their livelihood and everything necessary, and is also sufficient to be able to afford one or the other special thing. Or the other way round. It is also possible, if one's own budget and one's own abilities allow it, to modestly build up one's own independent work or one's own small business, etc., and through one's own efforts, endeavors, through one's own personal perseverance and the necessary commitment, to achieve better prosperity and a little luxury, if one feels like it. And if something more results from it, like some wealth, then on the one hand it has itself come into being and become reality through one's own work, as a result of using one's intellect, reason, intelligence, effort, and commitment in an honest way. This is in contrast to the false hopes of clueless people who want to get rich quickly, who are lured by elements such as dubious bankers, financial jugglers, brokers and financial sharks, etc., with empty promises for allegedly profitable money transactions and who, as a rule, end up looking down the tube and losing all their painstakingly saved silver pieces, never to be seen again. And the fact that criminal elements, who call themselves financial experts and consider themselves to be such, lie to the population and especially to the uninformed and unsophisticated that the modern economy cannot manage without credit and therefore debts have to be incurred, which is nothing but lies and fraud and therefore does not correspond to the truth, is the last straw. For if, contrary to this lie and this fraud, action were taken in accordance with what I have explained with regard to the fact that no debts are incurred, but that in every respect everything is only ever paid when the necessary capital is effectively available. Then the economy would also have no financial problems. The tendency of the population to incur debts in order to be able to buy useful or useless consumer goods, as this is also peculiar to financial jugglers. Businesses and firms, farms, many kinds of small businesses and concerns, etc., which want to become bigger and richer by doing so, is becoming more and more extensive and insane. Effectively, there seems to be no way around it, just as there seems to be no way around the fact that the experts of the entire financial world do not realize that through the debt-making systems, on the one hand, the entire nationwide financial system, and on the other hand, also the entire social system and the state system itself, are being made more and more unstable. If a mountain of debt piles up more and more, then the whole thing becomes more and more threatening, be it in a private business or state way, in companies, businesses, corporations, in agriculture, or in any other business, etc., because ultimately the debt can lead to ruin. If we look at the debt situation in general today, the fact is that almost everything in the world, so also Switzerland, is in debt, the populations, the states, the industrial nations, and the emerging countries. If we look at the world's most important economies, their debts amount to more than twice their economic output. There is no end in sight, not only for the debt-ridden population, but also for all states themselves, as well as for the industrial groups, companies, farms, and small and large enterprises of all kinds that live on credit. Strictly speaking, debts are always harmful because large amounts of interest have to be paid for them, which, if they were saved, would more or less quickly replenish the finances that are needed and for which debts are incurred. And that is the case in every case. The obvious uneasiness that strikes reasonable human beings at the word debt is in fact fully justified. Debt has no economic raison d'etre at all, because one person's debt is always another person's claim, who insists that interest be paid for lending the money owed. It is true that from an economic point of view, it is undisputed that credit increases the welfare of an economic system. But when the whole thing is effectively investigated, other results emerge, which are ultimately that the population is being financially sucked dry. The prices of everything and anything are being driven up higher and higher, and all the essential goods and flats and houses, etc., are becoming more and more unaffordable. Not least also because all the debt-making companies, businesses, farms, corporations and enterprises, etc., can no longer bear the horrendous interest on debts and the hassle of contracts, lawyers, maintenance needs, and production, etc., without driving up prices. And because everything does not always work out as it should, insolvencies are inevitably part of the daily routine, as was already the case in ancient times, from which the earthlings have learned nothing up to the present day and continue to run up debts in a moronic manner. If it were still as it was in ancient times, then extremely draconian punishments would be meted out, because if debts were incurred in those days, but these or the interest on them were not paid, then the result was, for example in ancient Rome, that the debtors were divided in two, lost their freedom, or were sold as slaves in other countries, as Babylonian records tell us. If we look at Switzerland's tendency with regard to existing debts, this means that, on the one hand, the costs incurred for government expenditure and, on the other hand, also the interest on the debt, which, at the current interest rate on the 100 billion francs of debt, amounts to around 1 billion francs per year, have to be paid out of the taxpayers' annual taxes. But this is not enough, because the still existing debts, currently still around 100 billion Swiss francs, can only be slowly reduced and eliminated through surpluses of millions and billions achieved. If no brainless idiots burn up these surplus amounts stupidly for some crazy ideas, etc., instead of using them to pay off the debt. If brainless idiots do not burn up these surplus amounts for some crazy ideas, etc., instead of using them to reduce the debts by the currently living taxpayers, then the mountain of debt will be transferred to the descendants or to the future generations and passed on to them, as a result of which they will, strictly speaking, be made liable for the debts that were charged to their parents, but which the government, etc., has incurred. So after the parents, their descendants or the next generation is asked to pay. Then again their descendants, etc., etc., who have to answer for the debts of the government of their ancestors and have to pay taxes for it, without being able to defend themselves or have a say in it. Unfortunately, this is the case and cannot be changed, no matter how sad and true it may be, because the Swiss welfare state is no exception among all the states in the world and continues to act as it has done since time immemorial, in such a way that the costs are inevitably passed on to future generations. And this will continue until finally reason, rationality, and intelligence gain the upper hand and triumph. The national debt is completely reduced, and no more debt is ever incurred. If someone who knows that debts are harmful and bring no advantages but only disadvantages, such as a human being who does a good job in state financial administration and can save finances, then come incompetent airheads of the co-rulers, who again squander the saved money senselessly, and thus undo all the efforts of the striving good and factually capable and finance-saving rulers. All those rulers, researchers and scientists, environmentalists, as well as those responsible in any other way with regard to any important matter are, as a rule, not experts in the sense of effective expertise, but only big-talking big earners at the expense of the well-being of the population, society, and the world community. Also with regard to nature, its fauna and flora, the climate, the waters of all kinds, as well as with regard to forests, land and soil, the atmosphere and the planet itself, they have no or only insufficient knowledge. Above all, however, not in such a way that they could recognize the effective truth, which are the causes of all the problems of all the destructions that occur in the whole of nature, in the atmosphere, and in and on the planet Earth itself. To all that I have now explained, the following nonsensical stuff can be found on the internet regarding a way to stop climate change. These proposals are also null and void, because on the one hand these plans are absolute nonsense, because they cannot bring success, because the annual gigantic increase in overpopulation and the additional 18-year-olds coming into adulthood, who also create enormous amounts of greenhouse gases, because they also alone make the possibility of fulfilling the plan impossible. And this happens because the target is also exceeded again through new and greater emissions before the target is even reached. But listen to the nonsense I have found here on the internet, in which not a word is written about what really needs to be done effectively, and would actually be the only solution, namely a long-term and worldwide birth stop, and the worldwide birth control that would then be necessary.
Wikipedia, a milestone for coordinated action at the international level, was the adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) in June 1992, of which more than 190 countries are now members, including Switzerland. The basis for decision-making is provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC), founded by the United Nations Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization, in the form of recurring progress reports. According to the IPCC, a successful climate policy consists of mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation refers to all measures that lead to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, such as increasing energy efficiency, promoting renewable energy sources, or also reforestation. Adaptation refers to measures that reduce the sensitivity of natural and human systems to the current and future impacts of climate change. These include flood protection, the greening of cities for natural cooling in summer, or the use of more drought-resistant plants in agriculture. Switzerland is committed nationally and internationally to an active policy to reduce greenhouse gases, recognizes the 2-degree target and ratified the Paris Climate Agreement in October 2017. In order to comply with the climate agreement, Switzerland aims to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% compared to 1990 levels by 2030. At the heart of Switzerland's climate policy is the CO2 Act, which is currently undergoing a total revision. It provides that the existing CO2 tax on fuels such as heating oil can be raised to 210 francs per ton of CO2, currently 96 francs. The building program, which has been paying out subsidies for energy-efficient renovations in the building stock since 2010, is to be replaced from 2026 by targets in the building sector and, if necessary, by CO2 limits for old and new buildings. The CO2 regulations for new cars from the EU are to be adopted on an ongoing basis, and emissions trading is to be linked to the EU system as soon as possible. These measures belong to the category of mitigation, that is to say, mitigating climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, as envisaged by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Switzerland is also pursuing the second pillar of climate policy, adaptation to climate change.
Your long monologue undoubtedly gets to the heart of the matter in every respect, but it is already clear that it will be the same as always, namely that neither those responsible for the state, nor scientists and environmentalist organizations, etc., nor the populations of any countries will pay any attention to your words, nor will your explanations be taken seriously. And this will also be the case with regard to your statements concerning the accumulation of debts in all state administrations, state leaders and municipalities, as well as in groups, associations, armies, companies, and corporations, as well as in agricultural enterprises, etc., in small, medium, and large enterprises, and privately, also in the populations in all their strata. And it is not only in the state leaderships that irresponsible, extremely extensive debts are being incurred, but also privately among the peoples themselves, because all around there is only disinterest, indifference, and rejection of everything that would be necessary, correct, and unavoidable. But I also have a few things to say about all that you have said, and I will begin with this. Unfortunately, it is the case that the entire population of the earth, and thus also all state leaders and governments, as well as all scientists, etc., place emphasis on the nonsense that every Earth human being has the right to decide for himself or herself whether and how many offspring are to be produced. Of course, this corresponds to a fundamental right of every Earth human being. But this is also connected with the very great responsibility which every individual is obliged to follow and bear, that the environment and thus the entire existence and extensive life of the biodiversity of nature, fauna and flora of the climate and of planet Earth is not disadvantaged and is neither harmfully affected nor destroyed. However, this requires, if I do not want to express myself in a long monologue, that I only briefly say the most important things and the following. The responsibility of every Earth human being is not only based on the preservation and well-being of his or her own personality and those close to him or her, but also fundamentally on keeping the entire environment, the climate, all of nature, its fauna and flora, and thus the extensive biodiversity alive, protected and in a healthy and righteous manner. Various important factors are connected with this, whereby the most important and decisive circumstance and point of view for the preservation of all the values mentioned is that of maintaining a planetary measure of humanity, which in relation to the planet Earth is basically 529 million, but which at an absolute maximum must never exceed 2.5 billion Earth humans. An excess of more than 529 million Earth humans brings with each individual planetary inhabitant increasing and ever more serious problems, which are not caused by the planet, nature, and fauna and flora, etc., but by humanity and the individual human beings themselves. The human beings themselves are in the midst of a lifelong and diverse phase of mental development, as are all life forms throughout the universe, which requires evolutionary progress that must be laboriously worked out by each individual human being. This difference in the level of development of the life forms, whereby I am now also considering Earth humans, inevitably leads to differences among them, although these can be kept within acceptable limits if there is not an excess. But a low population of humanity appropriate to the respective planet, which for Earth is to be calculated as an ideal measure of 529 million. Any measure above this inevitably leads to factors which impair all peace, freedom, justice, joy, and self-control, and give rise among human beings to jealousy, disloyalty, injuries, impairment of self-esteem, fear of loss, possessiveness, faithfulness, bondage, dependence and envy, strife and hatred, from which arise violent degenerations which lead to the killing and murder of one's own kind and to massacres, but ultimately also to extensive acts of war, destruction, and the extermination of whole peoples. And these degenerations, contrary to the laws of creation, increase with each increasing world population, whereby with a population mass of 529 million human beings, which would be permissible on Earth according to the natural order, the resources of the planet could be used as long as human beings would exist, and the treasures of the planet could be used in a reasonable manner with moderation and purpose. The Earth could easily support and cope with an overpopulation of up to 2.5 billion. But even such a mass of world humanity produces such vicious and insoluble problems that neither peace, freedom, justice, nor righteousness can exist or be created. Also, all attempts to create these values usually end in impossibility, consequently only for certain short periods of time, perhaps a few years if it takes a long time, do not take place. The fact is, however, unfortunately, and not only among very many of the undiscerning and belligerent Earth humans and their leaders, etc., but also on other worlds in the universe, that hatred and strife arise almost constantly and incessantly somewhere in the world among the native peoples, often also as a result of wrong and dictatorial leadership, whereby uprisings and civil wars arise which claim many lives and cause great destruction. It is also not uncommon for Earth humans to have riots, acts of terrorism, and feuds that arise from completely misanthropic and malicious xenophobia, hatred of nations, and hatred of religion. In the same way, warlike armed conflicts between hostile peoples occur again and again, while ultimately global world wars are also waged, in which there is always the danger of total global destruction if weapons that destroy everything are used without reason or responsibility, as was the case in the last World War with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the Americans. And the fact that with the development of such atomic weapons of destruction, the greatest crime ever committed by mankind was committed, was of no concern to all those Earth humans who advocated this crime at the time, as it is still advocated today by the completely irresponsible. Earth humans, in spite of the world wars that have taken place so far, have also not become of better mind and therefore reject peace, freedom, and justice far from themselves, as they have always done, because they are held captive by their religious sectarian delusion of God, and as they have done since time immemorial without their knowledge, spread all evil and harm in their supposedly good faith. Through the sectarian and independently acting energetic swinging waves affecting the believers in God with regard to their delusion of faith, everything leads to discord, hatred, and bondage, whereby the believers are unconsciously incited to vicious violence and against everything that is against peace, freedom, righteousness, and justice. The fact is that the religious faith in God in the foreground makes all believers believe in love and peace, joy and happiness, freedom and justice, while in the background of their faith evil lurks unceasingly, unconsciously, and is always ready to break out through degeneracy. All evil of every kind thus finds its origin in the religious and sectarian delusion of Earth humans, now numbering nearly 9 billion, whose deceptive and only superficially good, peaceful, loving, liberal, and righteous thoughts and movements of faith are only deception and fraud. This while in the underground manifold malignant factors of violence, war, bloodshed, hatred and revenge, retaliation, thievery, fraud, murder, killing, and hell-like degenerations are smoldering and are radiating corresponding energetic, power-charged swinging waves, which are spreading all around the Earth and are affecting all Earth humans in a malignant negative way, influencing them and causing them to act according to the inner degenerated religious delusions. So in reality and truth, through every religious, sectarian delusion of God, the exact opposite of what is pretended to be, such as love, joy, peace, balance, and compatibility, freedom, righteousness, and justice, inevitably happens. Effectively, at every possible opportunity. What is thought and accepted or also only assumed to be good and positive according to the delusion of faith is immediately translated out of the inner malignant delusion into negative thoughts, impulses, and outward actions. Consequently, every possibility of events, situations, actions, and behavior, etc., which are opposed to one's own world of thoughts, emotions, mental and sensations, or which cause personal harm, loss, pain, disadvantages, or one's own physical and mental discomfort, inevitably leads to the outbreak of all the energies of force lurking within. Already with an excessive population of 2.5 billion, which is hopelessly trapped in its delusion of faith, peace, freedom, and justice, can no longer be guaranteed. Thus, in relation to today, the fact is, since Earth humans already number almost 9 billion, that the whole of religious delusion can no longer be stopped. Consequently, in the future, through the malignant sectarian energetic delusional vibrations emanating from all delusionists, which, as a result of the multiplication of believers through the unstoppable growth of overpopulation, are constantly increasing and becoming more and more aggressive, it will result that increased and henceforth ever worse mischief and malignancy will come out of everything. And this will be so unless the majority of the Earth's population finally comes to its senses and frees itself from the delusions of its delusional beliefs and does not turn to reality in order to undertake everything necessary with regard to the penetration of reality and truth into the consciousness of Earth humans. And this must be done in order that they may learn to strive to direct their senses and aspirations, their thoughts, actions, and behavior towards the incontestability and irrefutability of effective reality and its demonstrable truth, which proves itself in all that materially exists, in all that is visible, tangible, palpable, and in the existence of the entire comprehensible universe. It can be repeated that with every religious delusion, and thus with every God delusion, of whatever kind and creed, neither peace, freedom, righteousness, nor justice can be created, which is why everything evil in every conceivable relationship and respect will degenerate and become rampant and bring much more disaster upon Earth humans and the planet than has happened so far. This also with regard to violent hostilities or private wars between individuals for the assertion of any claims or as a result of even simple differences of opinion. But there will also be increased militant conflicts and deadly hostilities as well as boundless hatred arising from everything, as well as endless feuds between families or clans, as also among noble families, whereby civil wars, wars between nations, and world wars will also arise, which, however, is not possible with a normal planetary appropriate human world population, or can only be the case on an extremely small scale and only locally or in a small area. What has come about on Earth up to the present time has come about and will continue to come about from every great mass of Earth humans, which at the present time is already 17 times overpopulated and, through the unreasonableness and selfishness of Earth humans, is continually becoming even more catastrophically overpopulated every year with over 100 million new births, whereby the more extensive the overpopulation becomes, the more all the dangers, as I have called them, increase with it. From this, it follows that consequently great human beings live in constant fear of warfare, loss, deceit, killing, murder and treachery, etc. The corresponding world population. Each individual nation and each individual human being as much to blame for this as all state authorities who abuse their governmental power and cause quarrels with other countries. And they do this by interfering without permission in the affairs of foreign states, by word or force of arms, in order to distinguish themselves unlawfully and high-handedly as the planet-dominating Gewalt, as is also the case on Earth since, which I must also mention once, the United States of America has distinguished itself in this way in its delusion of hegemony since time immemorial. But the same obsession with power is also evident in the European Union, which in reality does not correspond to a federation with equal rights in all matters, which should be the purpose and the right of a union, but it effectively corresponds to a diabolical dictatorship, which imposes its dictatorial demands on all member states and prevents them and their peoples from enjoying freedom, peace, and their own legislation. The dictatorship also denies the EU states and peoples the possibility to make their own decisions and forces everything and everyone under the EU dictatorship power, which you also mention again and again, and which I also want to say openly for once, and also mention that this dictatorship is doing everything to also bring Switzerland under its rigorous rule. This could be possible, however, if unauthorized diplomatic representatives from the Swiss government continue to negotiate with the cunning and underhanded leaders of the EU dictatorship and sign and comply with the imposed perfidious and malicious contractual agreements, provisions and consents, etc., that are insidiously damaging to the Swiss state and its population. Both the USA and the EU dictatorship and its vassal states belong to that framework from which all efforts for peace, freedom, equality, and justice are suppressed and destroyed, as well as any honest efforts and friendship of peaceful coexistence with Switzerland and other states. Like the USA, the EU is also only interested in the exercise of power, which both carry out with vicious means of coercion to expand their hegemonic goals, irresponsibly overlooking all law, bloodshed, and destruction.
Thanks. Your comments also hit exactly the points that needed to be said.
But it will neither be understood nor accepted by the majority of Earth humans, because on the one hand they are not understanding, but on the other hand, as a result of delusion full of cowardly fear of divine punishment. They do not dare to think even a single thought that would be directed against the religious delusion, and thus towards the real reality and its truth, and would therefore be afflicted with doubt. On the other hand, this delusional majority is so caught up in its religious sectarian delusion of God that, due to its lack of initiative, it cannot summon up even a single attempt to conceive a thought that is capable of understanding and reason. Therefore, I can say with certainty.
English translation 714th contact. Part 2 Tuesday, the 1st of January 2019, 21:51 hours.
Greetings, and if I interrupt your conversation.
Edward has just finished a long monologue which has very remarkable facts. I just wanted to say a few words about that, but not in such a way that I would necessarily have to elaborate on them, so you will not disturb us.
So greetings and welcome to you both, you Yanarara, and also you Zafanat Panich. It's good to see you also coming here once again.
I also greet you and want to say that we have a lot to explain to you, which will be of interest to you. Yanarara, however, will say what is necessary.
I have already explained some basic things to Edouard in connection with other remarks.
Right? Because Ptah also did a little monologue and gave interesting explanations and explanations that have it all.
That is good, but you should not call up my explanation, which I am going to give now, in full later, and also not write it down in an open manner, but only pass on what is necessary verbally to the core group members, etc. if necessary, because these are facts which must not be made public. On the other hand, I would like to recommend that you make public all that Zafanat Paniach and I have to explain through your association periodicals. So you should not give too much information, because the sectarian vibrations of belief and their impulses, which emanate from the bulk of God-believing Earth humans, and have caused and continue to cause a great deal of mischief since time immemorial, long ago developed a momentum of their own, which has driven human beings to vicious acts of violence for millennia, and continues to do so.
It will be in keeping with the need for your monologue and mine to also be considered for publication.
Then I now have the following to explain. As humanity continues to grow and expand, the mass of believers addicted to a religious and sectarian delusion of faith expands. But with this, the religious believers increase the disastrous energetic swinging waves, which have already spread around the world a long time ago and have formed an immensely energetic and powerful energy screen around the planet. From this screen vibrate independently formed and constantly intensifying impulses, which also act independently and affect the entire population of the Earth in different ways and bring to an outbreak the degenerations that are glowing in the inner character being. In a perfidious way, these impulses primarily affect all religious believers of all faiths on Earth, and their delusions of faith are strengthened and accumulated in them by the vibrational impulses. Consequently, the believers in their confused faith become more and more entangled and inaccessible to real reality and natural truth. From this follows the incontrovertible and undoubted truth that the delusion of faith of every religious faith of every creed, also of other non-religious faith-related devotions, such as philosophies, ideologies, and worldviews, etc., is the cause of all the imaginably degenerated disorders that have occurred among the Earth's peoples since time immemorial. Every belief of any form corresponds to an uncontrollable delusion, which is based first in a conceit, arising both from external misunderstood influences and suggestive persuasions, etc., and also through a deception of the senses, conceit, illusion, lie, a fraud or self-deception, a dazzle, a sham, misrepresentation, pretense, trickery, evasion or feint, through a will-o'-the-wisp, a mystification, a bluff, hocus-pocus, or through deception. And this also proves that all faith of any kind has been the cause of all human degenerations since ancient times, and indeed of all the abominable, disgraceful, and horrible and atrocious violence of all kinds that has taken place. And this is true of strife and hatred, vindictiveness, jealousy and depravity, vengefulness, killing and murder of all kinds, torture, thievery, fraud, and all other degenerate atrocities, up to catastrophic and indescribable wars of all kinds, contemptuous of every life, morality, honor, and dignity, and intolerable and degenerate. This begins with food wars, insult wars, feud wars, family wars, race wars, religious wars, wars of the sexes, wars of the nobility, civil wars and wars between nations, and ends with world wars. In addition, our research back into the distant past has undoubtedly shown that the fundamental origin of every single degenerated event and occurrence throughout all times of all centuries and millennia was solely the swinging waves and impulses caused by religion and belief, which were therefore to be found as the first and last cause. Through every religious delusion, as through other forms of belief, the vibrational impulses of the hidden, degenerate impulses glowing in the inner character being are intensified, which are present without distinction in all human beings in the form of degenerations of all kinds in relation to malice, hatred, lies, deceit, revenge, violence, jealousy, killing and murder, terror and war, destruction, annihilation and extermination, and other dangerously smoldering impulses. In a further way, through these vibrational impulses, all the inner smoldering, violent, and degenerate impulses are concealed by the delusional religious belief in such a way that they are not outwardly recognizable and not visible as malignant defects, while they are, however, perpetually maintained as negative malignant inner impulses. Everything comes to a head in the most dangerous way when these degenerated and malignant inner impulses break out and have an uncontrollable effect on the outside in every conceivable violent way and bring disaster. The outbreak of the evil and violence smoldering in the inner impulses of believers occurs when they can no longer maintain the outward concealment of their degenerated inner impulses through their delusional faith. If this happens, then the vicious inner impulses of the believers break through uncontrollably to the outside and lead to violence. And for this to happen, very little is required, such as the believers being harmed in some way, for example, by words, an insult, a racial difference, by quarreling, lying or cheating, theft, slander, jealousy, assault, a difference of faith, etc. But even a simple difference of opinion or an unintentional touching of the body can be the cause. By the outbreak and release of vicious and dangerous inner impulses veiled by faith, believers are driven to vicious acts of violence, which escalate into killing and murder, but also to hatred of every kind, such as racial hatred, xenophobia, hatred of truth, hatred of justice, and jealousy, etc. Furthermore, envy, deceit, fraud, acts of war, terrorism, and a variety of criminal, inhuman acts and deeds, as well as all kinds of vices and addictions, etc., also result. Hate is expanding again, especially in our times, and very violently in relation to racial hatred, which is once again rising, whereby in particular a newly flared-up hatred of anti-Semitism, which is once again spreading rapidly, has been expanding for some time, which is steadily increasing towards Israel and the believers in the Jews, and has an emotionalizing effect on many unstable Christian believers, which is also happening in a malignant way through the energetic vibrational impulses of all human beings who have fallen from God, whose faith also has a malignant effect in this respect and conjures up new disaster. This new racial hatred is driving especially many believers in the Christian faith in Europe and the USA, as well as fanatical Islamists and otherwise moderate believers in Islam, to anti-Semitism, which ultimately leads to anti-Zionism, which aims to annihilate and destroy Israel on the one hand and the Jewish population on the other, as well as the Jewish religion and thus the whole of Judaism and its believers. And if this is not counteracted by reason and rationality, then this hatred, which has been smoldering for some time now, especially in France, and also again in Germany, will continue to spread unchecked. But what I have to explain now must remain under lock and key with you.
With this, everything should be clarified and said in this regard, while I still have the following to say with regard to your computer work, in which you are repeatedly harmed, after 17 years of research and clarification. It is now clear that all the strange occurrences in your workroom are sectarian and energetic vibrational impulses of the entire earthly human race, which lives under the delusion of religious faith. And these sectarian vibrations of faith, as Yanarara has already spoken of them, emanate from all believers of all denominations and faiths, have been accumulated and afflicted since time immemorial and continuously influence the entire earthly population to all conceivable and extremely viciously degenerated acts of violence, as Yanarara has explained. This also refers to what has occurred and is occurring with regard to all the malignant disturbances and damages that have occurred in your computer work and have extensively affected, distorted and disorganized your work in various ways, which will continue to be so to some extent. This is because you are obviously to be prevented from exposing the untruths of religions and religious sectarian delusion, which is why the vibrational impulses that have become independent and are acting independently are also increasingly influencing and increasing Earth-human sectarian faith. Your energetically powerful consciousness is the cause of all strange happenings and occurrences in your working space, as well as of the extremely unpleasant disturbances and damage as well as work disturbances that occur in your computer equipment. The cause is not that the energy and power of your consciousness would cause the disturbances and damages, because its energy and power is far above anything normal. And exactly this is the reason for the strange occurrences in your workroom regarding materializations of foreign objects and things up to great values. Also, the energies and forces of your consciousness that are above every norm are the cause of the disturbances and damaging influences in your computer with regard to your work, which is not infrequently destroyed and ruined for you. Consequently, you have to do the same work several times. But when I explain that everything of this kind finds its cause in the energies and forces of your supernormalized consciousness, this does not mean that you would trigger and bring about the whole of the unpleasantness through your consciousness itself, for there can be no question of that. The energies and forces that trigger all the disturbances and damage, as well as the strange materialization processes, are based, according to our almost 2 decades of extremely precise clarifications, research and analyses carried out together with the sonars, on the sectarian swinging waves created by Earth humans and their self-acting impulses. And through these religious delusions, which have arisen since time immemorial and which, as a result of the further growth of humanity, as well as through the resulting further growth of believers of all denominations, all earthly peoples have been influenced by the sectarian belief-based vibrational impulses since ancient times, and are still being influenced today and will continue to be influenced in the far future. And these swinging impulses result from every religious belief of every believer of every denomination, and every religious sectarian belief always and in every case corresponds to an uncontrollable delusion of the imagination which sets off rectified swinging waves. These then combine and integrate themselves into the mass of existing similar swinging waves of all human beings who have fallen into a delusion of faith, accumulate and are again radiated back enormously strengthened onto the whole mass of Earth humans who have fallen into a delusion of faith, whereby further and still more mischief is spread. And this happens, as it has since time immemorial, in that hatred, malice and violence are stirred up to ever greater extremes, and endless mischief of many kinds continues to spread over the Earth's population and the Earth, whereby wars, destruction, and annihilation are inevitable, as well as a final consequence, the extermination of peoples and groups of peoples. The fact is that these swinging waves and their impulses are such that the ugly, evil and violent inner impulses, which are concealed by the delusion of religious faith and thus not outwardly recognizable, nevertheless cling inwardly in human beings and foment and ignite underground. These then come to the outbreak and degenerate, whereby malicious violent mischief arises when any circumstances such as fear, anxiety, illusory love, disadvantages, threats, cowardice, need, hatred, jealousy, hunger or suffering, as well as misery, lack, vice, addiction, sickness, sorrow, pain, self-protection or depression, etc. The power of the delusion's imagination blurs to such an extent that it is no longer possible to hide the malignant and violent inner impulses, but these break through to the outside in the most evil degenerations, as malignancies and acts of violence. Now the fact is, as I have already explained, that your supernormal consciousness, as well as the logic of your thoughts, is the reason for all the occurrences of materializations of various things in your working space, as well as the disturbances and the damage that occur to your work in and with the computer. The energy and power of your consciousness is indeed the cause of all these phenomena, but not in such a way that they are triggered by your consciousness, for this is in no way the case. For the fact is that through your energies and powers, which you logically create through your thoughts and feelings. You strengthen the energies and powers of your consciousness, and thereby make it invulnerable and repellent to the belief sectarian-based vibrational impulses acting upon it. In addition, however, and this is the reason why I say that your consciousness is the origin of the whole, it results that through your energies and forces, which you create and thereby strengthen your consciousness, this has created and works against such an energetically strong block of rejection against external swinging, waves and impulse influences that it cannot possibly be attacked by such energies and forces as these are given by the sectarian delusion of Earth humans. But as your consciousness can neither be influenced nor brought under control by these swinging waves and impulses, because it repels all attacks and lets them swing back, they have an effect on your nearest or nearer surroundings. In this respect, of course, your working space is the nearest environment, which is then affected by the delusion-founding energies and forces thrown back through your consciousness, which emanate from the earthly sectarian delusion-infested human masses and can manifest themselves in a materializing way as well as in a disturbing, distorting and damaging way with regard to your computer and your computer work. These belief delusion-conditioned oscillatory impulses have already made themselves self-activating in ancient times, like an artificial intellect, and since then they have acted self-activating on the one hand by influencing the entire religious believing population of the earth through their faith, and by tempting them to hide their malicious and violent inner impulses through their faith, but to maintain them inwardly, to strengthen them, and to let them erupt at every possible opportunity. Self-acting, these sectarian-believing swinging waves and impulses have a much further effect in that they disturbingly and damagingly attack every human consciousness and, influencing it in a compelling way, lead to religious delusions and thus to the delusion of faith. These vibrational impulses also have a self-acting effect in that religiously addicted believers, as well as people otherwise only weakly or hardly inclined towards a delusion of faith, have their inner malicious and violent inclinations and impulses mobilized in order to harm, disturb and damage fellow human beings physically or otherwise in a malicious and violent manner, whereby such degenerations can also be the ultimate consequences of killing and murder. If penetration into consciousness is impossible, then the whole thing transforms itself in a self-acting manner in such a way that the corresponding energies and forces of the vibrational impulses have an effect on the near or nearer environment and cause disturbances as well as damage, etc., whereby electronics in particular are susceptible to this, as this relates to your computer, which is why you will have to endure a lot in this respect in the future. Unfortunately, this will take time, because even if we make great efforts to further investigate the dangerous delusional energies and forces, and also to master them, it can still take several decades until we will know how to control them. Up to now, we have needed almost 2 decades of intensive efforts to track down these swinging waves, impulses, and their energies and forces, because they were absolutely unknown to us and therefore completely alien, as were their extraordinary, alarming, unheard of, and threatening effects in many relationships. So we must first think our way into this matter as a whole, and work our way into it and research it thoroughly, which will take years or decades. Just as for us Plejaran and the sonar all the facts mentioned, thus also the energies and forces were unknown, which result from the religious or sectarian delusion of faith of Earth mankind, which we ourselves were only able to recognize after almost 2 decades, but which we must now also fathom and investigate. So we also had to recognize through our investigations that these religious sectarian delusion of faith-conditioned energies Forces, swinging waves, and impulses are also absolutely unknown to all earthly sciences. Not a single science, and thus not a single Earth human being, has any idea about this. Consequently, not even the slightest trace of an inkling is present.
Man, today it seems that only long monologues need be delivered. But thanks, my friend, because your remarks, as well as yours, Yanarara, again clarify all sorts of things. But you said that the delusional energies and forces of the delusional earthlings swing back or are thrown back by my consciousness in order to then have an effect in my surroundings. For a better understanding, I think that the whole thing can perhaps be explained as a parable in such a way that the functioning or exercising, accomplishing or working of the energies and forces in my working space and on the computer comes about because my consciousness simply pushes away the sectarian oscillation impulses accruing to it and forces them to swing back. As also happens, for example, with two magnets when the two poles of the same direction are joined together. If this is done, then the poles of the same direction repel each other and push each other away. This, while in my consciousness, however, one must rather assume a factor that acts like a powerful repelling shield against the sectarian swinging waves and their impulses, which are flung away and then cause manifestations in the surroundings. But I would rather use magnets as a simile for understanding.
Your explanation is well chosen.
I also have a few things to explain to you about what Zafanat Panich has explained, but you should only treat them in secrecy. It is valid.
I also thank you for what you have explained, and I will stick to it and not talk about it openly.
You will keep it that way, and so we can say goodbye again. Be careful in all things, for if you make known that which you need not conceal, then.
I know that well enough, and I have no illusions about it.
Then goodbye, Edward, but remember that your safety is important. Then let us go now, Zafanat Panich.
Do not let their words go unheard. I too bid you farewell, my friend.
Have a good one, then also take care together.
Slowly, I also must.
Excuse me if I am still holding you back, because I have one more question. If it is possible that I can still bring it up, and then lay out some necessary things about it?
That may be possible, but in 20 to 30 minutes at the latest, I must turn to an unavoidable duty.
Dear thanks. Then the following. We have already talked several times about why and where and in which of the different ages in the past your father Svath brought me, which you read about in his annals and then asked me for details as a result of your interest. Therefore, we also spoke about the fact that I should mention something about it in one of our open conversations. Precisely what Svath taught me about, so that facts concerning it would also be recorded and kept for later times. The reason for this is that if one day the Earthling scientists were to find important fossils and other proofs that everything was completely different from what they have all tried to prove for centuries with absolutely false hypotheses as past history, one day, new and effectively doubtless research findings will also reveal Darwin's deception and prove that human beings on Earth are not descended from apes. To this now the question whether I should say something about it today, if your time does not press you too much, so that I could still at least say something, in order to find a beginning for once for what you think it is necessary to mention and to put down in writing.
I did not think of that, but you can of course disclose some things in the manner mentioned, though you have to consider the time, because I have to think about my duty, which I cannot fail to do.
Already clear, so I will of course be brief and only elaborate a little that, as I said, once a beginning is made, after which I can then mention further things from time to time. Then I will only mention a little of what I have to say about the teachings of Svath, beginning with the fact that Earth humans did not originate in the south, but in the north of Africa, which was already openly mentioned in one of our conversations. This is also contrary to all so-called scientific anthropological claims or the science of human beings and their development, which also includes philosophical, biological, cultural, and forensic anthropology. Also that the human beings who allegedly originated somewhere in the interior of Africa, who in truth originated in an area near the Atlantic west coast in South Africa, somewhat later than the appearance of those first human beings who originated in North Africa, migrated from there to the east, which today is called the Orient or the Orient, as well as to the North or the Occident, as well as to Asia, etc. All this corresponds to a fairy tale, as does Darwin's fraud. His fraud, which he committed by filing monkey bones to prove that the human beings of the earth descended from monkeys, which was unfortunately accepted and believed due to the stupidity of the scientists of the time, is still being defended today by countless ignorant people. This is in contrast to the fact that the Earth human being actually emerged from a creature that had nothing whatsoever to do with apes, as Svat showed me in the 1940s at the Messel pit as a fossilized fossil, from which the Earth human being then also developed in North Africa. However, we never openly talked about the fact that a human form also developed in Europe from the same species of life form that I saw as a fossil in the Messel pit. We never talked about this openly. Just as I never talked about the fact that the small life form that I saw as a fossil was distributed worldwide in several species, and that human beings also developed from these species in various places on different continents, although they all differed anatomically in certain respects. All of them were quite small at first and only grew into larger upright beings or human forms in the course of a long time, which then also spread in many countries in a sparse manner and partly also mixed with Earth foreigners, as a result of which they also took over their genes. In particular, this resulted in such contacts and connections with Earth foreigners, which also gave rise to the modern humans, who were, however, quite barbaric and cannibalistic, and consequently did not always treat other human beings as their equals. Consequently, they also killed them as enemies, just as they imprisoned and slaughtered others, such as the Neanderthals in Europe and Eurasia, as living food stores when they needed them for food. These modern human beings arrived in Central Europe around 185,000 years ago, not the 45,000 to 50,000 years ago that our Earth scientists claim. So they settled in Europe earlier, even if no fossil finds have been discovered for this so far, and also no evidence that they had kept Neanderthals partly as prisoners in relation to emergency food during their first appearance in Europe, although they then later lived together somewhat peacefully with the dying Neanderthals throughout the region for several millennia. That, dear friend, is actually what I want to say today, because you have to do your duty.
So if you have no more question, then I will.
Excuse me, I would like to say something else. As a result of the serious accident I had last year on the 1st of June, when they wanted to operate on an artificial metal shoulder joint, etc. in the cantonal hospital, which I chickened out of, as you know, I can no longer do my writing as quickly as I did before the accident. Unfortunately, I now need 3 or 4 times more time to write than I did before, which is why I cannot get on with the work I do for you as quickly as I used to, and also with writing down the reports of the talks when I call them up. That's why I would be happy if I no longer had to retrieve and write down all the important points of long official conversations that we plow through. Of course, I realize that longer dialogues are necessary and contain important information, but I would be happy to use my discretion in retrieving and transcribing them if necessary to cut them down a bit.
That is not the point, but doable.
It is just that it takes me an interminable amount of time to retrieve and transcribe long conversations, and it makes me drag my feet with my private stuff, which I also have to do, among other inevitabilities.
Act at your own discretion. But now I must go, Edward, my friend, for my duty calls me. Farewell, and I will be here again at this time to do the necessarily ongoing correction work with you. Goodbye.
Take care, my friend. Also goodbye, Ptah.